Today we have a very interesting discussion, and one of most importance, as we recently commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11, our attacks on the Homeland, an event that changed America for forever. So I thought that we would bring together our law enforcement fellows, or senior law enforcement fellows, to have a discussion about a look at terrorism and the homeland since 9/11. I think the dynamics of our country have changed, especially when it comes to in the context of law enforcement in particular, but in particular with regards to terrorism. We're going to hear from Marc Black. Marc is a retired New York Police Department detective, NYPD detective, who has served in a variety of capacities and units during his tenure. And we're following Marc, we're going to hear from Larry Cunningham. Larry spent much of his career in the Secret Service. In fact, he worked very closely in a senior position on the Reagan detail, President Reagan's Secret Service detail. And batting cleanup, I guess, on this on our roster of three fellows is Martin Johnson. Martin is a retired detective, Howard County, Maryland Police Department. Now, what is important and why I hold, or one of the reasons why I hold my colleagues in such high esteem is, aside from their stellar careers, they currently spend much of their time traveling the country, teaching law enforcement at all levels regarding matters relating to counterterrorism. So for a topic such as today, I think they are most qualified to discuss this. Marc, I'm going to turn it over to you. So what we're going to do, just the way it works for everybody to know, and Marc, for you as well, is we're going to hear from our panelists, about 5 to 7 minutes apiece. And we're going to follow that by Q&A if anybody has any questions. And I certainly welcome our panelists to ask each other questions or make some comments. If you do have questions, please raise your virtual hand and we will call on you. In the meantime, everybody is muted except for the presenter himself. So Marc, without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. These are very interesting times that we're in. And I use the old saying, what's new again is old again, what's old again is new again, particularly when we talk about terrorism. And having been a detective who, from the Detective Bureau, doing investigations, this is really something that has come forward once again. And we can go even, not just 9/11, but even back to the 70s and 60s, when we look at the type of groups that are really grabbing the headlines today. And not just the left-wing groups or the right-wing groups. We can also look at the terrorist groups coming out of the Middle East and what we have today as the Islamic extremist. I think that today, what we're going to see is that because of the policies that were put in place, and I'm talking strictly here from a police perspective, an investigative perspective, not on policy management. This is what happened. I retired in 2020 from the New York City Police Department. I was involved in counterterrorism, arson explosion, computer crimes investigations, intelligence work as well. And I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who's worked the streets and still speaking to men and women who are in law enforcement working the streets. I think the biggest challenge now going forward in defeating terrorism or investigating terrorism is what has just happened with the defund the police movement in the United States. And I bring this up because, as our distinguished panel, we've spoken about this many, many times before, you've had a mass exodus of experience leaving law enforcement in the United States. Now, this has a repercussion on how cases are going to be handled, investigated from experienced investigators. And what I mean is, let's say you have somebody who's in a joint terrorism task force, for instance. Let's say that that person's coming up for retirement. Well, where do you grab another individual to fill that position for that person who's just retired? Well, that person might come from the homicide squad, from a computer crime squad, from an arson explosion squad, from a special victims unit. And what we see is those people in those units might have gotten so frustrated with the defund the police movement that they've left. And now your retention rates aren't keeping up within a lot of these departments. Add upon that, the low morale that has happened within these departments, all this experience that is left, including the mentorship that has left, has not provided the future law enforcement professionals coming up the ranks with insight and with vocational skill sets, because policing is a vocation. It's not just by reading the book, reading the guidelines, it's actually learning from mentors. And mentorship within law enforcement is so important because it's not just for the rookie coming on board, it's for that individual who might have 10, 15, 20 years, who needs that experience coming into a specialized unit, such as a joint terrorism task force, such as in the bomb tech world. This is very important. And this is going to have ramifications within the investigative wing to counter these investigations, these terrorists. The other thing is that I want to bring up is that what we've seen presently, the way that it was handled, it's funny. What happens overseas will eventually start to happen here in the United States. We just saw an attack happen on Yom Kippur, or a plot that was actually caught by the Germans at I believe it's the Hagen Synagogue, where a suspect, an Islamic extremist, a boy of 16 with 3 others, were arrested, and they plan to use explosives on a house of worship, the synagogue. What you see is when governments are weak and the way that we project ourselves to the adversary, this is going to have ramifications, and we're going to see a spike, probably, and I'd say a high probability, in terrorism. Why? If an adversary sees that one is weak, and they understand the surroundings and the environment that they're going to operate in, they will attack. And we see that. Terrorism is a crime, and criminals are like water. They follow the path of least resistance. And if you are not strong and are not committed to having efficient and effective investigations with the support of upper management within your police forces and within your local government, you're going to lose the talent. And if you're not going to put the right policies in place, and my esteemed colleague, Larry Cunningham, will go more into that, you are going to lose a lot of dedicated men and women, not just in law enforcement, but also in our intelligence field and in our military fields as well, who work in this vocation of counterterrorism.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm honored to be here to have a voice in these troubling times. And I want to bring out that I've been studying this for more than just a few years. I had kind of a keen insight when I first started my career in the Secret Service, dealing with threats not only to the president and the country in the immediate environment, but also in a larger scale, larger view, and actually the global environment. So I was blessed with that perspective from the very beginning. This is not a localized situation. It's much larger. It's systemic. It can be systemic. It can be political, but it has implications and a domino effect that affect everyone, not only here, but the planet. And terrorism in the homeland has certainly increased. And it's a multifactored problem. But one of the key problems is the fact that our adversary is very formidable, normally very intelligent, very diligent and extremely patient, which many folks in the civilized world don't quite have that patience. They don't always have the same resilience, so they kind of tend to gravitate from one emergency to the next, to the next. Meanwhile, our adversaries seem to rest and stay and focus on things that, frankly, we lose interest in a very short period. They study these things exhaustively and diligently, nuances, behaviors, political trends, and legal trends. And they basically look at them from a perspective, where's the vulnerability? And it evolves. It evolves from one attack to the next, from one political diatribe or political statement to the next. So they are constantly looking at our strengths and our weaknesses. And I'm reminded of a philosophy that I fully support and engage and embrace more than ever, and that's Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher general who more than 2,500 years ago basically said that if you want to prevail in 100 battles, you need to know yourself, your strengths and weaknesses, and your enemy and their strengths and weaknesses. And I use that kind of as a foundational platform because we don't do a good job really at either one. And for us to really be successful, we need to look at that from that balanced perspective, the good guy hat, the bad guy hat. So a couple of things have happened here. And in the last 5 or 6 years, it's gotten a little bit worse. Candidly, a political narrative has taken hold. And from my view, this is one of the key problems, foundational problems. It has basically infected our judiciary, it's infected the populace, and it's infected business. And so we have, as law enforcement operatives, folks that want to look at history are facing a multitude of challenges, not just a political narrative, but a narrative that seems to have garnered support from a larger perspective. So, wow, what do? It's very difficult. We have to basically keep looking at galvanizing our compadres, galvanizing our message and showing that really in the long run, what we're advocating, stronger law enforcement, stronger voices for basically citizens' rights in terms of protecting them, and then basically explaining that this is not a political narrative. It's like oxygen. We all need to be protected. For the short term, there may be a political gain to say, well, the police are being cruel or they're being overreactive. For the short term, that might appeal to some folks, but what they fail to do is look at this from a long-term historical perspective. And as a result, I'm reminded of another quote that basically said, those who are ignorant of history are damned to repeat the lessons of history, essentially. And so this narrative has been lost in terms of where we're going and what we're looking at. Another challenge, which is often overlooked, and it's significant because the universities, many of them, have adopted this defund, anti-police, anti-law and order perspective. They sort of acknowledge we need some sort of law enforcement perspective, but they haven't really understood the long-term history of it, the history and the empirical evidence of why that narrative is simply wrong. So what we have is we have folks, in fact, I read a recent article from the Kennedy School that basically said police are not using an empirical basis to do their work. They're not tied to science enough. So they need to be more scientifically based in terms of their protocols and their policies. Well, I read the justification for that, and basically they said because of that, they're going to lose their strength. They're not going to be able to justify what they do in terms of a validated construct. Well, that's fine, but the problem is police work doesn't fit a nice, neat scientific narrative. And it basically has a much longer history and it's much more dynamic. So we're fighting another entity, the university complex, which is basically vilifying us, saying that we're not empirically based, therefore we're not valid. It's a very short-sighted, one-sided opinion. So when you take that together with the populace that have been transformed to believe that law and order is really a problem that needs to be transformed, we have the judiciary and business, and now the universities, we have a multi-factored threat. I would remind everybody that we need to go back to the basics and understand lessons of history and look at empirical data in terms of what do the police do or what have their successes been. And I think that's literally vitally important that we look at it from that perspective.
Martin, let me let's have you jump in here, and then we'll go to questions if anybody has after that.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Martin Johnson. As Ellie mentioned, I was with the Howard County, Maryland Police Department. I just have to make sure that I say I am still a civilian employee there, and my ideas are all my own, and I do not represent the police department. So a number of things jump out at me with these topics that we talk about. It is obvious, at least to me, that an awful lot of policy decisions on the state, local, municipal, and federal level are fostering disorder in our country. We are allowing, we are tolerating, in fact, in some places across the country, we are encouraging Antifa. When I say we, I'm talking about people who make decisions, the people who we have gone to polls and elected to make our laws and make rules for the way we are supposed to live. So BLM riots, Antifa, anything that these things cannot, should not be tolerated when they go beyond expression into violence. But we do, and it's just been going on for a couple of years now. Where else does this happen? Now we're seeing it spread. We just saw in the last few days, we saw the riots in Germany. With the disorder, the tolerance of disorder and the encouragement of disorder is something that's going to be destructive to the homeland, to the interior of the country. We don't need to put up with those things. I'm not suggesting that we shoot people in the street. I'm suggesting that, like the police chief in Detroit said a year and a half ago, don't come to Detroit to trash our city. Don't think that you're going to come here and burn our buildings, because we're not going to put up with it. We're going to grab you and we're going to put you in jail, period. So anyway, that's just a big picture thing that we put up with so much. And if, as Marc and Larry talked about, if you put up, like as Marc said, criminals and criminality is like water. It takes the path of least resistance. And if there is no resistance to this fostering of disorder, then that's where it's going. That's what's going to happen. It's going to happen. It's going to happen repeatedly, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Reminder: we had the Baltimore City mayor during the Freddie Gray riots who said, "Let's give them room to riot. It's only property damage. Let them get it out of their systems." Well, nobody got it out of their systems. It simply steamrolled, and it snowballed into something worse and completely out of control. So, talking about what Marc has talked about and Larry talks about, leadership in law enforcement is extraordinarily important. The guys on the street, the men and women on the street, are the people who really do the job. If they don't know, not just feel, if they don't know that their backs are covered, if they don't know that their leadership is going to take care of making sure that they are defended when they do something right, and look, 99.99% of cops in the country are there to do right. We're not there to make money, folks. No, there aren't any rich cops running around. But the thing is that we have to know, and I've talked with officers very recently as 2 weeks ago, who's still, not in my department, but in another department, who still feel that their backs are not covered, that they are not going to be backed up if they make a decision. And so the default is to do as little as possible. It's to answer that. I'll paraphrase what one officer told me, and actually a supervisor told me with a span of control of 9 officers. I told my guys, answer your calls, back each other up, look for nothing. Don't go looking for anything, because we're not in this other police department. We don't feel like anybody's going to back us up if we make a decision. that may have been questionable. You know, a lot of this comes from a lot of what we are fed through the news media. You know, an officer shot and injured a violent child abuser who was a fugitive, who was reaching for a knife to stab the officer. What did we have? We had news coverage, unarmed man shot by police, shot in the back, riots, the whole, you know, the whole thing. It just follows through. Yeah, here we had, last week, we had a drone strike. Stick with me on the concepts. We had a drone strike in Afghanistan that killed 10 innocent people, including 7 children, and it was deemed a non-success. That's a quote, a non-success. And General Kenneth McKenzie of Central Command said, "We didn't have the luxury of time. We struck under the theory of reasonable certainty." That's a direct quote. Well, you know what? Those officers were that officer was reasonably certain that that guy was reaching for a knife that the officer saw so that he could stab him with it, because they'd already fought with the guy. We had riots and terrible news coverage for the officer. And what do we get with this? It's okay. You know, they took a shot. It's crazy. I'll try to wind up. The fostering disorder includes bringing and allowing and encouraging millions. By the end of the year, it's going to be millions of people into the United States. Now, I am all for legal immigration. We have a system for that. There's an orderly system for that. And we, you know, the United States historically has, over the last 20 years, has admitted legally 1 million people per year into our country. Yet we flew out, according to the government statistics, we flew out from Afghanistan 114,500 people. 5,500 of them were American citizens. That leaves 109,000 non-citizens have just been brought into the United States. And of course, we pay for it. The Mexican invasion that's coming across the southern border. Del Rio, Texas, has got 15,000 people who the Mexican government, we just found out yesterday, the Mexican government, these people had been in Mexico in a stagnant status. And Mexico said, you know what? You guys are out of here. We're going to ship you from one part of Mexico to the US border at Del Rio, because the cartels do not have control of Del Rio, the Del Rio crossing across the river. So it's not going to cost you anything. There's no danger. We're shipping you there. That's why we have these aerial shots of 15,000 people in and around and under a bridge at the border. What does this do? Are these people being vetted? No, it's impossible. I have no papers. You have no way to check me. They're not being vetted for terrorism, criminality, or COVID. So I know I'm all over the board here, but my main thrust is that these policy decisions on the part of cities, city managers, counties, states, governors, and the administration appear, I hope they're not, but appear to be operating under the rubric of surrender and abdication of responsibility, which fosters disorder, which is harmful to the country on the whole, and to individual victims when they fall prey. So thank you, Ellie. Appreciate the time.
No, thank you, Martin. And you know, I'm going to start with Marc. I have a question for Marc, but also going to. I have 2 questions. One is going to be open to the 3 of you, but one in particular is for Marc. So I'm going to start with my question that's open to the 3 of you. But Marc, you'll give both answers, and then we can move on to Martin and Larry if they want to jump in. So the question, there was a lot of talk about local issues, Antifa, BLM, and so on. There was talk, Marc in particular, you spoke about retirements and lack of training moving up for the new classes that come in. But especially given, as Martin talked about, the open border, open southern border, what just recently happened in Afghanistan, what's happening in other parts of the Middle East, in particular Iran and that area. As you look forward, or as you're looking over the past 20 years and you're looking forward, what percentage of the threat, in other words, where's the main focus? Is it on Antifa and BLM? Or let me rephrase it, where should the main focus be? Is it Antifa and BLM? Or in fact, is it external threats coming into the homeland? So that's question number one, and I open that to the three of you. But my second question is, and then I'll let you answer both, Marc, is in 2010, Mitch Daniels, who was the president of, who was the governor of Indiana at the time, had dinner with me in Baltimore, and I was talking to him, and I said, so we recently killed bin Laden, and is there anything that you're doing in your state to increase security should there be an attack in some way, shape, or form by somebody who was upset about the killing of bin Laden? And he laughed and he said, listen, I'm in Indiana. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, come on. Now, that being said, over the past year plus, we see a migration from states like New York and California to places like Florida, but also to areas like North Carolina and so on. With the rise of anti-Semitism and other hate crimes throughout the country, how concerned should these states be about terrorist activities? These are things that like Mitch Daniels, I'm not really, he wasn't overly concerned at the time about a reprisal due to the killing of bin Laden, but times have changed. Should governors and should mayors and should local and state police be concerned as we look to the future and the terrorist threat to the homeland?
So let me answer that question both at the same time. All right. Terrorism is not sedentary. It's fluid. And what you have to understand with the terrorist act, or what the terrorist is looking for, is not only to persuade a populace to agree with them, but because we're in the social media times right now, they realize that they can get the same amount of exposure, whether they attack in a rural area, a suburban area, a regional area, a national area, or an international area. And that's what they're looking for. So has terrorism changed over time? As I said in my opening statement, what's old again is new again, what's new again is old again. We saw the Weather Underground, the revolutionary cells coming out of Germany back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. We also start to see that now. But now there's another dynamic with Antifa and BLM and other left-wing groups. But now what we have is, because of what just happened and since the pandemic is over, this is very interesting. During the pandemic, I will never forget this. I was sitting at my desk when I was still working, and this was approximately about April of 2020, and a flash came over, and we were all sitting at the desk, and it was from ISIS. And ISIS was telling their people, do not travel. Why were they telling their people not to travel? Two reasons. One, they weren't so much concerned that their individuals would get sick, per se. They were concerned about getting exposed. In all of our cities around the world during the pandemic, what happens? Let's take Times Square. It became a ghost town. So there's 8 in the attack life cycle, And one of those is the pre-surveillance stage. And what had happened was, how are you going to do pre-surveillance when there's no populace? When the norms of the day are gone, you're going to get exposed, right? So they said, don't travel. The other thing, of course, was if they caught COVID and someone's in an operational stage, they would have to go to the hospital, and that's another way they would get exposed. So ISIS put out this thing, don't travel. So they're very smart. The adversary is very, very smart. About the attack, where we should be looking right now is everyone looks at, when we look at how they look, the terrorists are looking operationally. As I said, they're a criminal element and they want the path of least resistance like water. I will say that if you look at a tier 1 city such as New York, Chicago, Boston, yes, that is always an area where because of iconic locations, they want to make their statement. But I will say this, metropolitan areas that are suburbia, the suburbia areas to those metropolitan areas, right now really need to beef up their counterterrorism know-how, and they need to get smart real quick. As I said, if they want to make a statement, they don't need to make the statement anymore in a tier 1 city, in a large city such as New York or Chicago. They can go to suburbia and get the same exposure to the media. The other thing is, in some of these smaller cities or towns, they might not have the manpower nor the knowledge base for the investigations, and they have to call in outside resources. The other thing is the communities now have to take some duty of care. I deal a lot with houses of worship, and I tell houses of worship this all the time. The duty of care for your safety and security begins with you, the house of worship. That is your responsibility and your accountability. With respect to severity attacks, you cannot rely on the police department. Why? Look at every severity attack, mass casualty incident. The time the police arrive, there's already been serious physical injury and or death. Now, working in New York City or Chicago or Boston, where pretty much as a police, if we look at Manhattan, a police officer on every single corner, the response times are lower. Let's look at, now you're in suburbia. What's the response time for the police department? And now with the funded police movement, where a lot of these rank and file have shrunk, what is going to be response time, and how long is it going to take to get assets to basically stop the threat, and particularly to stop the threat of terrorism? Now, it's not just going to be houses of worship. What about your hospitals? What about your malls? What there is a domino effect that the adversary knows. They're very smart. These are not people who, you hear them say they're crazy because they want to be a suicide bomb or what. They are very driven. As Larry had said, they're very patient, extremely patient. They will do a long surveillance on a location. They might even look at multiple locations. They will take their time on how to fund their operations. So for those politicians and those communities who are outside major metropolitan areas, they need to understand that terrorism has no borders, that the terrorist is going to look for the easiest target for the operation. And now, does that local police department, that might be 30 to maybe 200 people in total, are they equipped, trained, have the budgets to stop or to interrupt the terrorist operation? And will they have sustainable budgets to counter the terrorist threat? The terrorists already know the weaknesses. They already have done their homework. Are our elected officials and our police forces doing their homework on how to counter this? And it's interesting because I also train law enforcement as well on terrorism. And you see a lot of young individuals who are entering the police force now. It's become very young field because of what just happened, because of the fund police force, a lot of experience is left. They're like sponges for information. And I'm going to tell you this, the fund police movement, what they won wasn't the physical dollars of the funding. The physical dollars, that could always be replaced. The experience that left, the experience to provide that insight and that vocational knowledge to the younger generation. Because I'm dealing with people who have to respond to terrorist post-blast incidents. They are just in the beginning. To get somebody trained up in these types of positions is not 6 months. It's not class. You're talking a couple of years. When I was in the arson explosion squad, the training pipeline was a good 2 years. You take a young individual who might have been that just getting into the detective investigative wing or into a technical Cobra wing, right? You're talking a minimum of 2 years. For them to feel comfortable, 3 to 4 years. The adversary understands this. They understand this completely. And we have to get the messaging out to the suburbia and maybe tier 2 and tier 3 cities that they need to get the funding and the training up to speed to start to counter this threat.
Excellent, Mark. Thank you. Larry, I saw you posted, picked up your hand, but let me just jump to Martin, if I may, just real quick. Number one is, Martin, for you is, of course, you feel free to answer the question about how much is that you see as Antifa and BLM versus external. But the question I have for you is, in particular, some of the things that Mark had said. You work certainly by comparison to NYPD, you're working with one of the smaller law enforcement, police departments in particular. What are some of the things that you have been over your career and looking forward, especially as you train police departments such as yours? What are some of those things that you're looking for for your size communities?
Number one is going to be awareness of the problem, awareness that the problem can exist, and the awareness that it doesn't have to be Chicago or New York or or Los Angeles or Las Vegas. The quick example, I live here in Maryland, and Ellie, you live in Maryland too, and so so does Larry. So we know of a place called Catonsville, and it's just a small part of Baltimore County, and it borders my county, Howard County. So in Catonsville, and this is going back a little bit, in Catonsville we had a case. I was not part of it, but there was a case where a locally radicalized. Now this is a person who lives in the United States, is here legally, and this person was radicalized, self-radicalized, and wound up mixing in with some terrorist intended radicals, and winds up getting what he thought was, thank God it wasn't, but he thought it was a truck bomb put together. And in little old Catonsville, which is just a little, it's not a big place. I mean, it's small. It's not New York. It's small. He goes and puts the truck bomb, a rented truck, sound familiar, like Ryder truck, like Alfred P. Murrah building. He puts a truck with what he thought was a huge explosive in the truck, parks it in front of a military recruiting station in the parking lot of this shopping center, where I shop, by the way, and winds up, he thinks he's going to blow it up, and he's dialing a cell phone to ignite it, and he's confused. He doesn't know why it's not blowing up. Well, as it turned out, he had opened his mouth to someone who notified the local police, who, and this is long before, who recognized what needed to be done and turned it over to what's called the JTTF, Joint Terrorism Task Force. And the guy who made the bomb for him, supplied the bomb for him, was an undercover FBI person. Thank goodness. Now, here's the point. If we don't teach what dots are, then we don't know, then the people who need to move that information aren't going to know, but they won't be able to recognize a dot. And remember, when I say dot, I think back on September 12th of 2001, everybody was talking about connecting the dots. Well, a dot was dropped and a dot was picked up, and it was picked up by the local police department who knew what to do with it. So it's an awareness, circling back, it's an awareness, first of all, that I want to teach. You don't know, you might get some little bit of information, you might get a call, you think it's nonsense. You can't think it's nonsense. You can't, it's like when you do a death investigation. I did death investigations. Everything's a homicide until you figure out that it's not. So you treat it as the worst possible thing in the world until you can prove that it's not. And not every death is a homicide. That's fine. So the point is training. You mentioned training, Ellie. When we're training young cops, training our baby cops, we've got to let them know and make sure that they have it in here. Anything can be a dot, and there's nothing wrong with. And in fact, we encourage, especially here in my county, because we have a lot of, the luxury of time, and we have a lot of cops for a small area. We need to investigate it as far as possible, and then make sure that if there is something that needs to be investigated further, we pass it to the right agency. Problem didn't occur. That guy, I think the guy got, I forget what sentence the guy got, but anyway, so that's what I worry about.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that how many of the 9/11 hijackers were in your county?
Well, that's true. I had 5 of the 19. 19 monsters brought the civilized world to its knees. Killing 2,977 people that day, faster than Hitler ever dreamed possible, and 10,000 since have died as a result of it. So, I had 5 of those guys in my county. I'm 253 square miles of the planet, 25 miles by 10 miles. And we had 5 of the 9/11 terrorists here in my county for weeks, living, breathing, drinking, eating, driving among us. So, and they were noticed. But unfortunately, many of the people who noticed them, their weird behaviors, they didn't call. They didn't call anybody. They were
But that goes to I guess the point of this discussion, which is that as we look at, it doesn't have to be only New York City or LA or Chicago that you're looking at, even the smaller counties. Larry, thank you, Martin. Larry, you had wanted to add to this, and then Susan, you're on deck.
Thank you, and I echo my colleagues' insights. I just wanted to take sort of a larger view of some of the problems that have contributed to this mess, candidly. And what I'm talking about is when you look at systems, you have to look at larger scale and come down to the immediate result of maybe a causation. And I'm struck by some of the work that we've done collectively, Marc and Martin and others, is that the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and terrorist organizations have evolved. Their leadership has evolved. They've adapted to the changing strength and the changing vigilance of police. And what they've done is they've gone from a traditional leadership role where they have a top-down general lieutenants and folks that go out and perform that diabolical mission. And what they've done now is they've done a very good job at sort of leading from an idyllic perspective and crafting a self-radicalization format, and it's been very successful. And so to answer your question, Ellie, about the rural areas, there are an ocean of evidence, an ocean of examples that can frankly show how this change in leadership has become very successful. And there's just a number of them. And frankly, the rural areas are the go-to areas because the bad boys and girls can sort of operate under the radar. And there's a number of folks, Zazie with the backpack bomber, crafting all his weapons in his uncle's garage in Aurora, Colorado. Speaking of Aurora, Colorado, James Holmes basically crafted his diabolical plan to kill several people at the opening Batman movie in Aurora, Colorado, as a matter of fact. Then you have Major Hassan going to the medical facility there and shooting people where he knew you're not allowed to have weapons. And all of these, and there's many, many others, including numerous school shooters who have basically operated in the rural areas. Some have posted things on media and so forth, but they've been able to work very successfully in remote, quote unquote, rural areas. So this is a very serious challenge to us. And what I'd like to say about this is a lot of the behaviors that these folks do in these rural areas, even though you might say, well, nothing's going to ever happen in Frederick, Maryland, or Des Moines, Iowa, or Howard County, Maryland, wherever the case may be. Really, it's contrary to that. Those areas, folks aren't as aware. And so in terms of one of the weapons and one of the countermeasures that I believe we could really implement to overcome some of these problems we're having is to empower the public, tell them what the telltale signs are, the pre-attack planning behaviors, the behaviors that are basically exceed the baseline and that might be nefarious or unusual. And there are 323 million people out there. And when you look at the leadership that's evolving with the terrorist leaders and the self-radicalization, that I believe sincerely could be one of our great countermeasures. I'll leave you with this. So with the leaders changing, the terrorist leaders changing their organizational mandate and constructs, and also with our leaders, sadly, putting forth this narrative that basically vilifies police at some levels, strengthens the mitigation of, the mitigation of what the police are trying to do, or basically undermining it, not funding it, and then basically not prosecuting folks that deserve it. And the media, both the technology and the media supporting this, that's really one of our key weapons left, and that is the public and empowering them. But I thought it was important to understand sort of the systemic role of the leadership and how it can influence the perpetuation of terrorism by the self-radicalization and therefore behaviors that the public might see that they could report. Thank you.
Excellent, Larry. Thank you. Susan Yoshihara.
Thank you. And I'm just really pleased to be in a room with folks who have so much experience, real tactical experience, as well as high-level experience on this issue. I wanted to ask to what extent women have played a role in countering terrorism. How have you had in your experience, or how have police forces used or incorporated women into improving our intelligence, our operations, maybe responding or countering terrorism, alerting to self-radicalization or radicalization of the men in their household, for example? I know that we had some success in Europe. And also, what can we do to better integrate women into this counterterrorism here or abroad? As you may know, this is an entire agenda funded by Congress that the DoD, state DHS, and USAID are implementing. And so I'd like to know what we can do to better use it for your purposes. Thank you.
Larry, Martin, Marc, you unmuted first.
Well, first off, I work with a lot of women and all sorts of people in counterterrorism, because you never know who the adversary is and what assets has to be put in place. So the whole thing of what are we using women? Are we not using women to their full capabilities? Women play a dynamic role, whether they're doing undercover work, whether they're working on the technical realm. So they're there, and involved in investigations as well. You know, we have to look at this, and we have to look at countering this as using the right asset to infiltrate and or stop the threat. To me, if we know who the target is, that individual, and we can put an asset in place that that individual feels comfortable talking to and developing interpersonal relationship, that's what you use. If you have somebody who's technical and you want to put them in place in that technical environment, that's what you do. The other thing is individuals in this particular field have to step up to the plate. This is not something in all my, whether I did computer crimes, whether I did arson explosion, whether I did working in counterterrorism, that individual has to step up to the plate and actually want to be involved in these types of investigations. I've worked with a lot of women in computer crimes. I've worked with women with crime scene investigations on crime scene, in counterterrorism. So really, also when you get into police forces, especially as large as NYPD, anybody can apply for the specific position, so long as there's the openings in there and they have the drive to do it. So I'm not familiar with what the administration is trying to do now, but I've come across women in the intelligence field, in the military field. So I don't see, if someone has the technical aptitude or that drive, put them in the position. We're here to catch bad guys. Doesn't make a difference who you are. And you never know what assets are going to be needed to develop that interpersonal relationship with the criminal. Heck, if there's a Martian out there, you get a Martian to do the job. If that's who the person's going to develop the interpersonal relationship, and you can get the information. That's what you do. This sort of thing. You take whoever is competent and whoever has that inner drive to learn, who also is efficient and effective, and also who can be a team member, and also is willing to understand the adversary in order to catch the bad guy.
Larry?
Yes, I'd like to offer a couple things. The female component here, I believe, from my perspective, might be underutilized. But there have been some good examples where their instincts have come into play. And in some cases, because of maybe a bias, they weren't utilized to the fullest extent. I'm struck by a name that popped in my head, Colleen Rowley, I believe, prior to the 9/11 attacks, was an agent in the FBI, and she raised the red flag about her instincts telling her that there's some folks taking flying lessons are paying $4,700 in cash for the lessons and only wanting to learn how to take off. And that's sort of that part of that story is common knowledge. But what a lot of people don't know is that a lot of females, and Mary Galligan was another one in the FBI who raised the flag on this. And I offer that because candidly, as adversarial and diabolical and difficult to understand and peg this threat, we need all and every perspective to try to find it out. And women have instincts that men don't. They have some pretty good intuition. So I think collectively that teamwork needs to be fostered and more fully utilized, because we need every and any perspective to really understand where these threats are coming from. I'll give you one other point here. I teach a criminal intelligence class, and I did a number of studies on that. And one thing I found is we need to get out of our bias in terms of doing everything. And one bias I noted was that, I'll give you a quick example. If we're studying the Middle East and there is a person, a man who has studied that part of the world for 36 years, and you have some intelligence that might help you unravel this piece of information. Well, the natural inclination is to say, I'm going to go to Mr. Jones because he has been working that desk for many years. But I often like to pose the other part of that question, and that is you have someone that's working the domestic desk with maybe 3 years experience. The question I pose is, would you dismiss that input, dismiss that experience? And some people that think about it say, well, no, he or she doesn't have the expertise. But others are a little more thoughtful, say, wait a minute, we have a very difficult adversary. We need to look at all these perspectives. It may be that the person with that many years of experience in the Middle East side may be doing things a certain way, and his or her thinking may be down a certain channel, where we need to have a diverse thought that may open up a whole new area of investigation. So I would offer that, yes, absolutely, we need a female perspective, a male perspective, maybe a younger person's perspective, because this adversary is not going away, and they become more and more diverse and more diabolical as we see here in this moment. I would offer they are crafting vulnerabilities based on things that are happening here and overseas.
So on that point, Larry, I'm going to ask Marc in particular for New York, for NYPD, and then I'm going to go to Ernie Dino. NYPD, I know, deals a lot overseas as well, and does a lot of training overseas. Whether you train others or others train you, getting a really a good understanding. How has that changed pre and post 9/11? And then how has that changed, let's just say, from post 9/11 to, let's just say, the past 5 years? And how important is that going forward?
So the after 9/11, what the NYPD did was they sent detectives overseas to specific countries. And the reason being for that was what Martin alluded to and actually spoke about, was the sharing of information and how quickly we can get it. So we had detectives go overseas and they were posted. And the reason for that was if something happens in, let's say, Europe, it's probably going to happen over here in the United States. So it was a matter of getting information quickly and intelligence quickly. With respect to training overseas counterparts with that, I have worked with some federal government, U.S. federal government agencies that were looking to understand how they could stand, to our friendly allies, how they can stand up counterterrorism units, such as the one that I worked at, in the friendly countries to the U.S. And that's really good on several fronts. First is that, as big as NYPD is, what is it? It's a local police department. People forget that. It's basically local policing. We have 5 counties, 5 boroughs, and we do local policing. And really, to catch the terrorist, you need local policing. So one of the first things we would always do with anybody who wanted to come from overseas and review what we're doing is we talked a lot about local policing, because that local patrolwoman who's walking the beat, they're going to say something to the citizen who lives on that block, is going to have, probably like me when I first started, I wasn't known as Officer Black. I was Marc. I knew every shopkeep. I knew everything that was going on, every single thing. Let me tell you. So if something was to happen on that street that was out of the ordinary, they felt comfortable coming to me. So we always started off, and I always started off, at least, you want to start a really good counterterrorism program in your country, you got to start with the local police, that person who's walking the beat. And then we got into more technical skills, of course, more technical types of things. And governments were good with that. And it started interpersonal relationships with not only the federal agencies I work with, but also with the individuals who are overseas, and, brainstorming and that sort of stuff, and different trainings that came overseas to help us, and we would help them. So that's very, very, very important. And that is something that Larry alluded to, that these communities, these law enforcement departments, I'm going to go back to this. This adversary, as we have mentioned, understands where they can capitalize on an operation. They understand this completely. They understand that the communities outside the major metropolitan areas are the weakest link. And the thing is, as Martin has made note of, is awareness, awareness, awareness. So if that patrol cop or that patrol officer is walking the beat down Main Street, USA, and a citizen comes out and says, hey, this is happening, that individual had a mother's intuition or a gut feeling that something is not right and approaches the police officer, they can follow up and contact the correct assets to be put in place or the correct authorities. We need to start focusing more outside these big cities so these patrol people and these smaller departments or mid-sized departments can have a greater awareness of terrorism, a greater awareness of what's happening globally, because whatever happens outside the United States is going to begin to come here. And we've seen that. And I'm going to give you a very specific case in point on this, which has ramifications across the United States. In Israel, car rammings, going back to 2011, 2012, the terrorists were ramming bus stops with vehicles. They would dismount from the vehicle and start stabbing people in at the bus stop. We then saw that sort of type of attack, vehicle rammings, then migrate to Europe. We saw that in Nice and we saw that in Berlin. It then migrated to the United States, where we saw it happen in New York City. If you take a touristy area in New England, a touristy area in Florida that does not have a very large police force, but you provide them with that awareness so they know, hey, we have tourism here in the summer. We know that although there's no terrorist threat on the board for us right now, but we have to protect the citizens, at least from a car ramming. They're aware of that type of attack. They know that they have to put the assets in place to protect the population. That's just one type of attack vector, but that has consequences that came from overseas, from Middle East, Israel, to Europe, to the United States, to Manhattan. And that's what these smaller communities need to realize.
Excellent. Thank you, Marc. General Bernadino, if you have any thoughts, you have to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah. Hey, yeah, thanks everybody. Sorry I tuned in late, but that's the nature of the beast these days with multiple telecons and meetings. Yeah, I got a couple of stray thoughts, and so forgive me if some of this has been covered, but the first thing I want to talk about is I don't know if we've defined terrorism so far in this meeting, but I think it's very useful. But before I do that, I'll kind of give you a homework assignment. Start paying attention to the news. I know you do, but with an ear to the many things we label as terrorism today. We are at risk now of misunderstanding what terrorism is. If everything is terrorism, nothing is terrorism. This is not going to help our ability to synchronize overwhelming force at the critical point in time. We get dispersed, we get distributed, resources aren't focused, attention is not focused. Everything cannot be terrorism. So a very useful definition, and one that I have found to be extremely accurate in my experience, is terrorism it's a technique, by the way. It is a tactic, technique, or procedure, but it is this: the intentional targeting of non-combatants for political or religious effect. Okay. Now, somebody's going to say, yeah, but what about the narco-terrorists? I got it. At the core, however, there's an economic basis for that. That's more akin to armed robbery on steroids. If we eliminate the economic element there, their ability to make a dollar off of narcotics, that whole thing kind of goes away. But when you're talking about matters of political ideology and religious faith, it's very hard to concede your faith or your ideology to somebody else. It is something you believe. And so the terrorists literally try to terrorize the non-combatants into submitting to their will. So we've got to be very clear of that. Now, the reason why I wanted to start with a definition of terrorism is the character of war itself is changeable, but the nature is not. You know, the nature is a violent contest of national will, right? But the character changes over the time. You know, there was an age when war was waged with farm tools, with stones, with arrows, and it was very close, it was very personal. And then it became, we morphed into the industrial age ultimately, where it was waged in mechanized form and much wider and laterally dispersed at much greater speeds. We're able to generate much more combat effect where and when we needed it. And now we're kind of we've transitioned into the information age. So we have to expect that the character of war is changing in the 21st century. And it absolutely is. There are very few adversaries these days who want to take on a superpower straight on the battlefield. The results are never good for the adversary. Saddam Hussein, with one of the largest armies in the world, collapsed in 100 hours because he was waging World War I and we were waging World War III. He could not appreciate how precise and deep and swift World War III types of operations could be. So that takes me to domestic terrorism. I think the deeper we get into the 21st century, and given what we know about the definition of terrorism and how the character of war changes over time, if we continue to treat the antidote to domestic terrorism as being a law enforcement matter, I think we're going to be left trying to play catch up. It's already far beyond just law enforcement response. And it's going to grow deeper in other areas. And so when you look at our nation's national planning scenarios, we have 15 national planning scenarios. And in all the years that I've spent in the military, we've rehearsed against these things. Every year there are national level exercises, highly classified, where we, I don't know who comes up with the specific scenarios we train against against those national planning scenarios, the operational and tactical level pictures. But each year they include an element of domestic terrorism in it. And when you look at the 15 established national planning scenarios, 12, no less than 12 are terrorism related. I'm going to pull some of these up right now, but the only 3 that are really not domestic terrorism related would be natural disaster in terms of an earthquake. That's National Planning Scenario 9. Hurricanes are National Planning Scenario 10. And 3 is a biological or disease outbreak / pandemic. But yet, all others include terrorism related events. Everything from bombings using IEDs, i.e. explosive attacks, nuclear detonations with improved nuclear devices, radiological attacks, biological attacks, there's several. Aerosol, anthrax, plagues, food contamination, foreign animal diseases intentionally, all right, that's under biological attack. Chemical attacks, including blister agents, toxic industrial chemicals intentionally used, nerve agents, chlorine, cyber. So I've just covered all 15. So, as we move deeper and nations lose their historic monopoly on mass violence, and we see that our adversaries have since Desert Storm, have tried to find end arounds to our ability to fight on the conventional battlefield. There's no mystery why we are seeing a rise in other sorts of techniques to get around that, terrorism being a key one. And when you're talking about a country that is a democracy like the United States, the center of gravity for just about every major endeavor we participate in at the national level, in particular war, the center of gravity for that is our domestic support. And terrorism in an information age, when you combine both the technique of terrorism and the reality of the information age, we are seeing this strange and hideous development where tactical events can have strategic effect. And ultimately, they want to break down our national will to resist. So I'll close with this. That none of that tells us, would suggest how to counter terrorism. But I'll use the example of the greatest theorist on war in the Western Hemisphere, at least certainly the most influential, Karl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz did not tell anybody how to wage war, but he told us how to think about war. And that itself is immensely, immensely beneficial to the practitioners. And so I'll close right there. Just my straight thoughts.
Thank you, Ernie. And just for everybody's transparency, Ernie General Bernadino is the Gold Institute's senior military fellow. So I'm pleased that you're able to join us as well. Crystal Hahn has a question. I see your hand is raised. So if you have any, so please unmute yourself and feel free to ask.
So I'm obviously German, and I'm very grateful that I could be part of this event and listen to everything. I have one question. As a normal citizen, I live in a rural area, very rural area. And what is your experience with bureaucracy inside police? Because my experience with the cops is, I don't want to go into details, is that they are very much governed by doing everything right, covering their ass, following certain procedures, doing it right. And maybe they don't catch unconventional stuff, like this. And I think it's so strong, these procedures that they have to follow, and that it is more important than maybe the real work. That's my impression I get. Maybe I'm too pessimistic in that. Fortunately, like the last event that happened, it was they were able to that it didn't happen. I mean, I'm very grateful for what happened, for what the police or whoever did that did it. But so I shouldn't be too pessimistic. But this is a general experience I have. Thank you.
Martin, do you want to take that?
Yeah, let me start. I can't address, I don't know the mindset, the overall general mindset for your area of the police. I can tell you that it comes down to individual officers, individual people, plus supervision equals, good people with good supervision can equal, and we hope it does, can equal success. And success is prevention, discovery or prevention of something bad before it goes on. So just from a having trained, over 5,000 police officers of my career, they are as many and varied in work ethic and personality and critical thinking skills as any group of people, like dentists or accountants or anybody else. So our training, at least where Larry and Mark and I, we do our training, we try to bring everybody up to the same level of awareness and recognition of what could be, what needs to be addressed, what needs to be dismissed, what needs to be addressed. So I know it's a long way to say nothing with a bright line. I don't have a bright line answer for you, but I can tell you that so much of it depends on the individual, and then what that individual is required to do, and especially with reporting, where, if there is reporting required, then where that report goes. And it has to go through a chain of supervision. And if the first person doesn't catch something that and recognize it as being potentially important, if that first line person doesn't catch that, we hope, and it is the responsibility of the next person, next approving person up the chain, approving meaning I read what the officer wrote, and what he or she is doing or is not doing is appropriate. So that's what we kind of have to count on. And you may not be being too pessimistic. There are some people, some officers who, after 5 years, they still don't get it. You know, and that's where the supervision needs to come in. There are many who get it, who understand and accept the training and are willing to take a look more deeply into things. So it's kind of a step ladder, and unfortunately, sometimes nothing gets past the first step. So it's totally individualized because they're human beings.
Larry, did you want to add something to that? Larry Cunningham?
Yes, I did. I appreciate all the remarks, and we're all going in the same direction from a variety of perspectives. But to take the comment on the general's insights, which I thought were aligned well with this evolving leadership and evolving threat from a lot of directions. And also, Crystal, to your point, this speaks to the awareness, not only to the public, but to the police as well. And the point you're making, you're identifying a void here that Martin, myself, actually all of us here, but specifically Martin, myself, and Marc, when we train our folks, much of the effort that we have and the theme of our courses is to change their awareness, change their perspective. And essentially we say, what else could it be? Okay, you have a domestic, or you have a trespass, for example. That's great. And we're all trained, and we tend to default to our very specific didactic training. But we try to emphasize that with this asymmetric threat we have out there, you got to ask, what else could it be? And so one of the key things we try to explain is, you know, what are the specific elements of the see something, say something? I mean, we see that all over the place. What in the heck does that mean? I mean, it means lots of things to lots of different people. And in our classes, and for the public, we have public courses as well, we give them specific examples of pre-attack planning, procurement of weapons of mass destruction, things that folks that become very obsessive about and preach about. And so as a result, we tell them, dial into those. And most important for all of this is provide some conduit of communication. So these messages from the public could get to the authorities and looked into, and maybe they can make associations that this has occurred in many parts of the country or many other areas. Let's put it together and let's do a focused investigation. I'll give one good example that highlights this. It's old, but it makes the point. And Martin certainly heard this. But we have an individual in Chicago. His name was Dr. Chaos Kopechnik was the guy's name. And he was trespassing on one occasion, one of many occasions, in the metro system, the subway system in Chicago. And he was in an area he shouldn't be, and he was arrested. And the officer who processed this person did his normal thing. The fingerprints, checked him for weapons, took his belongings, put it on the side, and did his normal SOP, standard operating procedure, for that type of arrest. But he was a little more insightful and a little more thorough. He had more awareness. And what he did was he took all his pocket litter, little pieces of paper, his personal effects, and he looked at them sort of critically. What else could it be? It's a classic example. So he sees these pieces of paper and he sees some chemical equations. He also sees a key which didn't fit the normal key. The keys normally are kind of like this, they're serrated edges. Well, the key that he found had offset edges. Sounds like a silly thing, but it was exceeded the baseline, it was beyond normal. He said, you know what, we're gonna talk to you a little bit more. I'm gonna call some more folks over there that know about this. It had, of course, this is a clue, Chicago Transit on the key. But at any rate, they looked into it. Lo and behold, there were 7 pounds of sodium cyanide in the storage locker in the Chicago subway system. Now, this is someone who went a little step further and basically averted a disaster, discovered an element of terrorism. So I can't say enough about how important it is to give some definition and specificity to the see something, say something. And along the lines of what the general was talking about, I agree. These national emergencies that have been identified are formidable, and there's some we can't control. But the magic in all of this is that if we rehearse these and collect and create information, decide what vulnerabilities are, and create a network, in the process of doing these, we're going to strengthen ourselves. We're going to galvanize relationships, understand how to allocate resources, and do a better job. So I'm all about that. One last comment, how do we fight this individual that is becoming more diabolical and utilizing asymmetric warfare? Basically, we need to understand that they are very happy with death by 1,000 cuts. You've heard that before. They might not do the classic 9/11, but they're doing little bits and pieces everywhere, which could achieve similar goals. So I think more than ever, we need to collectively come together, all 325 million of us, understand what the elements are, provide better communication, and stay with the fight.
Thank you. So if we have a final thought from General Bernadino and Ernie.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. All right, regarding the national planning scenarios, and the question on bureaucracy, there's sadly a relationship between the two. Every single year we conduct these exercises, and they're, as I mentioned earlier, they're highly classified against various planning scenarios and subordinate scenarios that nest into those. But where we fail is after the fact. The bureaucratic response is very sad. The reality is bureaucracies ultimately become self-licking ice cream cones. They forget who they serve. They tend to become serving of themselves. So these exercises conclude, we learn lessons, and every time I have participated in them, we come back the next year and we seem to be learning the same lessons. Sadly, we conclude exercises like this and we are supposed to go back and have the courage to fill in the gaps, to act to make those teams within our responsibility more combat ready, that's my term, more prepared. And so but yet we come back and we see these ongoing failures to prepare the next year. And then, and I trace that to failure of leadership. People are not stepping up and saying the buck stops here. I'm going to make sure my organization has learned from these last exercises so that we are better prepared for the real event should that come. But unfortunately, as we progress through these things, and I've participated in them, I see organization after organization coming in the next year and practically starting from zero. It is unacceptable. Let's bring back courageous leaders who do not lead via, this consensus decision making. Consensus decision making only hides responsibility for a bad decision. Step up to the plate and do what is necessary. That's what I urge, the folks that I engage with in my current job. Guys, we got to do the right thing and not be apologetic about it. So there you go.
You know, if I could just chime in real quick, Ellie, and that general is where you get to your recruiting new people and mentorship. They follow the leader. It is so true. They will follow that leader if they believe in that leader.
Yeah, organizations take on the personality of their leader. It's
Yeah,
just
well said.
So thank you, General Adino, for those remarks. Before I end, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge and welcome the Honorable Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman, who is the Kurdistan Regional Government's representative to the United States, who joined us today. Bayan, welcome, and I look forward to having you on our future calls as well. I also want to make sure that everybody's aware that on Thursday, you should have received notification about this. We're going to have another briefing, and this one is going to be relating to the transatlantic issues, the U.S. Foreign policy, and where we are or are not when it comes to issues relating to Europe, the UK, France in particular, and as well as Australia in relations in particular to the recent contracts to build submarines for Australia. So that's going to take place on Thursday. Our panelists are Jeffrey Van Orden, member of the British Empire, and a distinguished fellow at the Gold Institute, as well as Dirk-Jan Epping, who is a member of the Dutch Parliament and also a distinguished fellow at the Gold Institute. So that's going to take place Thursday. If you haven't received the information about it, please let me know, and we will get that to you. I want to thank, finally closing this out, Marc Black, Larry Cunningham, and Martin Johnson for a fantastic discussion today. These are issues that we have been working on for quite some time now, in particular relating to the growth of anti-Semitism and terrorism. In fact, Martin, you participated in a briefing in the Senate along with myself and some others at the Institute just before COVID, if I'm not mistaken. It was like February, right before COVID, talking about a new terrorist threat, which is the growth of the ever increasing growth of anti-Semitism. So that is that's something that Marc, Martin, and Larry have been working on diligently over the past couple of years at the Gold Institute. So with that, I thank everybody for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next briefing.
Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie.